course, the Bible, the user's manual is certainly what it is. It's a user's manual for all of us. It says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And of course, these are people involved in multi-billion-dollar international organizations, involved in organized crime. And these organizations are doing things that make them hundreds of billions of dollars. Better watch out. Or do I have control? I have no control. Bill Clinton's people must be in here somewhere. Well, you got it. This is what we're trying to prevent. This is a brain that shows the severe degeneration of the frontal lobes of the brain, and the temporal lobe, where this hippocampus that we keep hearing so much about, is located. This is what can happen at the end stage of dementia, and we're trying to prevent that. Now, one of the big questions that comes up when I talk about excitotoxins, people add, why don't all of them end up like this right away? Well, number one, it's not a toxin like cyanide. You don't take it and drop dead a few seconds later. It's not even a toxin like arsenic, where it slowly accumulates in the body over months and you get sick and die within a month or so. It's a much longer based toxin, a toxin that you can be exposed to as a child, and then when you reach your teenage years, you have difficulty thinking and computing and reasoning. And then as you become in your middle ages, you begin to develop these degenerative diseases, so that you may end up with Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, or some of these disorders. So it's a very slow accumulative thing. And what we have found out is that all the degenerative brain diseases are increasing, and rather dramatically increasing, and no scientist has come forward with an explanation of why. But when we look at the food, every 10 years they're doubling the amount of MSG added to food. Most people, when I talk to them, say, well, I don't eat Chinese food, I'm safe. Well, most of the MSG is not in Chinese food. It's in everything that's processed. Campbell's soups, all these diet dinner packs, all these Swanson dinners. If you look at them, they're filled with excitotoxins to add taste to it, and they're adding more and more and more. Every time I go to the store and check the labels, I see they've added more of these things. They're appealing more to the children. A lot of these Carnation instant breakfasts, these malted milk mixes, they're high in caseinate, which is very high in glutamate. So they're appealing to the children, and so that favorite malt mix or that instant breakfast, it's easy to mix up. They put in some milk, which is a wonderful liquid, and the two together is producing this damage. And of course, we're seeing an explosion of ADD and ADHD. In the last 10 years, there's been a 600% increase. Now, some of that's because the psychiatrists and the psychologists in school want to classify a child that misbehaves as an ADD case. And then they tell them, you either take this child to the doctor and get them on Ritalin, or they cannot attend school. So they're trying to force the kids on Ritalin. I would just briefly say that Ritalin is very similar in its actions on brain as cocaine. And what they have found is that the children who have, through their formative years, taking Ritalin, it's very easy to get them to take the next step to be on cocaine. And one of the very common things we see in schools is that the children are selling their Ritalin to their classmates. A lot aren't taking it, they're selling it. So they're learning how to be drug dealers by selling their Ritalin to their classmates. And it brings a heavy price in school. The children are willing to pay big money for their classmates' drugs. So Ritalin is a cocaine-like drug, and Ritalin also, and the amphetamines that they use to treat ADD in the brain stimulate the excitatory pathways in the brain and produce long-term destruction of these brain cells. So that's another reason not to let them pressure you in putting your children on Ritalin. There's other ways nutritionally to treat that. We're also seeing an increase in violence discontrol in our society, where our young people cannot control their violence. They become very irritable, they become antisocial, they become self-centered. A lot of this is because of the moral destruction of this country, because there's been a concerted effort to destroy the moral base. But the drugs help do that, and I'm involved in some studies that have to do with a program that was initiated by the KGB back in 1960, in which they had developed drugs to destroy American youth. You know, they were the origin of the drug problem in the United States. That's one of the other guarded secrets that you'll rarely hear about. The problem in the United States was a program by the KGB initiated by Khrushchev. All the drugs came through Cuba or Mexico through the Communist Party to flood the United States, and it's all written out. It's in the archives where he explicitly said these things, that he was flooding the United States with drugs to destroy the youth so they couldn't think, so they couldn't fight in a war, so they could easily take over this country. Prescription drugs are also being used. All of this was developed. Our POWs during the Vietnam War, during Korea, were used as experimental animals in which they tested these drugs. They could develop a drug that, number one, would change your belief systems, and they were successful. I'll tell you, they made drugs that can change your belief system, which you lose your control over your mind. So they can tell you what you'll do, and you'll do it even if you want to resist. You can't resist. This was tested on our POWs, but that's another story. So what determines these agents? What they found is that the reason everybody doesn't have the same reaction, why some people will have the Chinese restaurant syndrome where their heart beats and they get the headache and they have a heart attack-like syndrome, that's because the MSG is acting outside of the brain also. Different nerves that involve inside of the thorax, inside the chest cavity. And that's why they get this Chinese restaurant type syndrome or feeling. And a lot of people assume, well, I don't get the Chinese restaurant syndrome, therefore I'm safe and it's not going to bother me. But it's really the person that doesn't get the Chinese restaurant syndrome that's in the most danger because he's not aware it's destroying his brain. The Chinese restaurant syndrome generally will avoid foods that give him that feeling or her that feeling, so they're safer. They have a signal that tells them they've gotten into some food that's bad, or they can't sleep that night. They go eat a meal and they're wide awake, just mind buzzing. That's because glutamate's such a powerful brain stimulant. They're unable to sleep. So they have an alarm clock. They're lucky. It's the other 90% of the population or 85% of the population who will not experience this peripheral response and this silent destruction. The brain takes place until the brain ends up like this. So to determine the sensitivity, whether or not you're going to be devastated and end up with this, and have lesser effects, a lot of it depends on your nutritional status throughout your life. If you have good nutrition, of course, you have better protection. Many of the chemicals that are in foods help protect you against excitotoxicity, as we'll see. So the person who eats a good, clean, nutritious diet, they're exposed to MSG, their brain is less. It increases the strength of the brain, it increases the antioxidants in the cells when you have good nutrition. And remember, excitotoxins kill brain cells primarily by producing enormous amounts of free. So if you eat a good, nutritious diet with a lot of vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients, your cells can overcome a lot of that free radical damage. Age, as we said, makes a lot of difference. 4 times more sensitive to the brain. So that's one difference. Heredity makes a difference. Some people are born with a lot of antioxidant enzymes in their cells. So they have very powerful, so they can survive a much higher dose of MSG in their food than someone who is unlucky and born with a low amount of these protective enzymes in their system. DNA in your cell can actually repair itself. It has special enzymes so that if the DNA is damaged, it can start repairing it. This goes on throughout your life. It makes a difference as to whether you age rapidly. That makes a difference whether you end up like this. It's your ability to repair this damage, and we know that varies in people. Some people have a very potent system of repair. Some have a very weak system of repair. If you combine weak system of repair and antioxidants are low and your nutrition is poor, then you're most certainly going to end up like this. So that makes a difference. If you possess one of diseases already. Say you already have Parkinson's disease, you're already having early Alzheimer's disease or ALS or multiple sclerosis, that puts you in a higher risk category. In fact, with ALS, what they found is that if you consume meat, just eat meat in your diet, you significantly raise your glutamate level. If you consume meat, or if you consume MSG, when they fed these people MSG, their blood levels went about 4 times higher than a normal person. Went very, very high. So there is some abnormal metabolism in people who are going to develop ALS that makes it when they consume MSG or meat, their glutamate levels go real high. That's Lou Gehrig disease. You know, it's a progressive degeneration of the motor system. We're seeing more of ALS in this country. Y'all know what Lou Gehrig disease is. It's where the arms or legs or the muscles of the throat begin to progressively degenerate.
How does a good brain look?
How does what?
Correct brain, a good brain, how does it look?
Well, it would look more like back here. See, this is all shriveled up. These look like a real sharp edge. That's because the cells in here have died. Same thing in the temporal lobe. This is the more normal looking cortex. This is all shriveled up. That's because the cells in there have died. But you see, it's very localized. It affects certain parts of the brain and leaves other parts alone. And what we find if you examine this, the types of cells in here are the types of cells that respond to glutamate. These cells don't respond to glutamate. So it's the glutamate-sensitive cells that are being destroyed. Now, as we continue down our list of what makes you particularly sensitive to this, if you possess a chronic disease, one of these chronic diseases is diabetes, and what's been found out is that as a person develops diabetes, and type 2 diabetes, which is non-insulin dependent, that's usually the adult onset diabetes, what they found is as you develop the diabetes, your body starts developing a lot of free radicals, and if they measure them in your blood, they see the free radicals start increasing. The longer you have the diabetes, the higher it goes. Developing complications of diabetes, heart attacks, strokes, lose a leg, the free radicals go up dramatically. So the appearance of these free radicals has to do with the destruction of. Now, if a diabetic is consuming NutraSweet, if a diabetic is consuming MSG foods, that greatly magnifies that process. So they're developing a lot more free radicals, and it's destroying their antioxidants at the same time. And so they get in a position where their disease rapidly. They're going to lose legs, they're going to go blind, they're going to have heart attacks, they're going to have strokes, they're going to have diabetes, and the doctor's never going to come to the conclusion or tell them, look at your diet. You're eating something in your processed food that is greatly, greatly aggravating your disease. And what do they tell the diabetic patient? You need to use NutraSweet. The NutraSweet company, Monsanto, is putting out flyers in doctors' offices advertising NutraSweet, giving bonus coupons, and they're also obstetricians' office to encourage them. They sponsor the Diabetic Association's runs when they have these runs that they do to collect funds for the Diabetes Association. They give out free coupons. They donate huge sums of money. They get free advertising. All of this is done to promote people to use NutraSweet. Well, the people they're promoting to use it are the people at the greatest risk, the diabetic. And we've shown that NutraSweet actually throws them out of diabetic control. And I've had quite a few diabetics that would get them off NutraSweet and they were just totally out of control for no amount of insulin. Nothing would get them straight till they got off the NutraSweet, and then their diabetes was straight. And there's a lot of diabetic type 2 patients that you can cure purely with diet. They can get off all the medications. They're healthy, they don't develop the complications, they don't go blind, they don't lose their legs, they don't have strokes. And so the first of that is to get off NutraSweet. It's an extreme toxin. Chronic emotional stress makes you a lot worse. We know that emotional stress creates enormous amounts of free radicals, particularly in the brain. So if you're under enormous stress At the time you're drinking MSG, drinking NutraSweet or MSG consumption, you're at very high risk of developing these diseases because the combination of the stress-producing free radicals and what's in your food producing free radicals is going to put you at high risk. Now, what is the most common theory of the formation of cancer? Free radicals. We know that when you feed animals glutamate, MSG, they produce enormous numbers of free radicals all over their body. And it lasts for a long time. They did an experiment where they fed animals MSG for the first 10 days of life, and then they measured the free radical generation 90 days later and found out it was still elevated 56%. Now, in a human, what that would mean, if you took a child that was fed them MSG for 10 days, when they were an adolescent, they would still have the effects of it. So it's a long-term effect that can occur. So it's important that you get people off of this as soon as possible. We know that as we talked the other day about aging makes you worse. Well, free radicals, one of the things they do also, they damage all your blood vessels. So all the blood vessels that are feeding the brain become damaged over all these years, and they begin to close off. So you're more likely to have a stroke if you're consuming a lot of MSG. And then when you have the stroke, your stroke is going to be a lot larger, your neurological deficit is going to be a lot worse, and your recovery is going to be a lot worse, and the chance you'll die from it will be a lot higher. Same thing with a heart attack. If you're on MSG in your food, we're seeing more and more people that die from heart attacks that are consuming MSG. And it's because it throws the heart into an arrhythmia, that is an abnormal beating, that cannot be controlled even with medications. They end up in the emergency room, it's their first heart attack, and they die. And I don't know how many people I've seen that had their heart attack after they ate a meal out at a restaurant. And then after that, they develop arrhythmias. They can't control the arrhythmias, and they die in the emergency room from a heart attack. Survivable. So that's something else to think about. Exposure to toxic metals makes you much, much more vulnerable. Exposure to lead, exposure to mercury, exposure to arsenic, and most well, I wouldn't be around arsenic, but if you do any kind of building and you use preserved wood, they preserve a lot of it with arsenic. And its fumes can get into your lungs. Level can rise. You get it on your hands. If you don't wash them thoroughly, it'll transport into your system, and it stays there for years. So these ways you can increase your sensitivity to excitotoxicity. One that I'll mention that a lot of people ask me about is aluminum. Aluminum is an enormously powerful free radical generator. It causes your body to produce 3 times as many free radicals as not in the presence of aluminum. Most people are concerned about aluminum and roll-on deodorants or other things, but the real source of aluminum a lot of times is medicines. If you look at your antacids, most of your antacids is aluminum hydroxide gel. That is a very soluble form of aluminum. It's taken by the body. It inhibits the absorption of magnesium. It reduces brain magnesium levels. Remember, magnesium protects your brain. It increases the amount of aluminum in the brain, and inside of the brain, aluminum inhibits the enzyme that has to do with the formation of acetylcholine. And that's a transmitter. That's one that allows you to remember and think and use your cognitive portion. So it inhibits that transmitter. It poisons the cell. It increases the free radical destruction inside of the cell. And if you look at all the degenerative brain diseases, including Lou Gehrig disease, all elevated aluminum levels. There's significant elevated aluminum levels in Alzheimer's disease in the brain, and in Parkinson's disease in that part of the brain, and in Lou Gehrig disease. So aluminum is very toxic and should be avoided. The other thing that people are not quite aware of is just how toxic pesticides are. We've heard a lot about pesticides over the years, and people use bug sprays and they're about it. They think it's safe. Well, there's a lot of concern about organophosphate pesticides, and that's the most commonly used. It was assumed that what organophosphate pesticides do is they block an enzyme that has to do with the formation of acetylcholine in the muscle tissue, and that this is what kills the bug. Well, we know in humans in high doses organophosphate pesticides will do the same thing in humans. But what we've just learned out that there's another mechanism that occurs far below, where that doesn't that enzyme, but it's extremely toxic over a long period of time. You've heard of mad cow disease. There's growing evidence that mad cow disease is really due to pesticides. There's growing evidence that it's associated with severe intellectual deterioration in children. And there's a case that came out in the latest Journal of Annals of Neurology of an interesting case. 5 people developed acute onset Parkinson's disease after spraying bug spray in their house. And there's one of the cases that was most startling was a lady who sprayed the bugs in her house for several days. She developed acute onset of Parkinson's disease. She was taken to the hospital, stayed there for about a month, and gradually started improving. So they thought they couldn't figure it out how you could just suddenly get a Parkinson's disease. So they sent her back home. As soon as she got back home, it came back again. They took her back out of the home, and they realized something in your house is causing you to develop severe Parkinson's disease. And they traced it down to the organophosphate pesticide. She ended up moving out of her house to another house, and she recovered fully. She decided she was tired of living somewhere else and wanted to go back home, so her family went and scrubbed the house meticulously. She moved back in and immediately developed Parkinson's disease. She moved back out, she recovered again, and so she decided later, well, I want some of my clothes. So she took some of her clothes from her house, and when she put the clothes on, she developed Parkinson's disease. So minute concentrations are causing profound disturbance in some people. Now, apparently, the people who are developing this Parkinson's disease in the face of organophosphate pesticide have some sort of problem, either metabolically, genetically, or whatever. They have a weakness that when they're exposed to these agents, they develop this disease. And so your termite man is using these things, your bug sprays, your wasp sprays, you're using all sorts of powerful agents to get rid of the weeds and make your yard look beautiful. All of that builds up in your house, and it stays there forever, as we've seen in this case. So that is a major cause of some of these disorders. And a lot of these pesticides, what they do is they make the body produce free radicals. Heard of paraquat? It produces the most free radicals ever known. That's how it kills. Electromagnetic pollution can also affect the nervous system and make you more sensitive to MSG. That's something that's sort of overlooked. For some reason, no one wants to look at that, and it's probably because of the enormous money power behind power companies. But there's recent evidence that shows that the power from a big transmission line can open the blood-brain barrier. And brain barrier, then all this MSG from your blood can pour into your brain. So working in a high electronic produce electromagnetic pollution and increase your risk. Now, I want to talk about this silent brain lesion. We talked about the Chinese restaurant syndrome. Most of it, you may have either such subtle effects from the consuming MSG that you don't really notice it. A lot of people that's been on this for a long time, processed food, eat out in restaurants a lot, they think that's how they're supposed to feel. And when you get them off of it, they cannot believe it. They say, I can't believe how much clearer I think. I can't believe how much better I feel. They've always thought that's how it feels. Everybody has trouble thinking. Everybody gets things the way I do. And what alerted me to it was seeing so many people that came to me that with a real concern developing Alzheimer's disease. 25 years old, you're not going to have Alzheimer's. Well, I can't remember anything. I have trouble thinking. And some of them even got disorders. Couldn't figure out how to get to their workplace or get home. And this is in 25-year-olds. I said, well, let's look at your diet. And, of course, they were eating enormous amounts of free radicals. And you clear it up, and then everything's better. How soon you get that out of the system. This can take many, many years, decades. And what we find with most of the degenerative brain diseases, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, Lou Gehrig, or whatever, the disease started long before you developed any symptoms. You do not develop neurological disorders until you've lost about 80% of the cells. So what happens is decades before, 20 years before, these changes are taking place. Recent studies have shown with PET scanning, which is a way to scan the brain and actually watch it metabolize, is that the brain's energy begins to fail about a decade before the disease takes place, when the person still thinks everything's okay. And you see decreased metabolism in those parts of the brain that were shrinking. And then as they reach the end of that decade, about 80% of those cells are dead or dying. They begin to develop the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So when you're treating them, what you're trying to do is save that last 20% cells. But those cells aren't normal, they're sick. So you're trying to save 20% of sick cells. And that's very difficult to do. And they have so many things present in the brain. Iron levels, high aluminum levels, some mercury is increased in these disorders. We have all changes like beta amyloid plaques in the brain. All of these things are sources of toxins inside of the brain now. And so that's why treating Alzheimer's disease, these other degenerative diseases, is so difficult. Because you get them, they already can. So the idea is to start before you ever get it, and it may be preventable or it may be reversible. The study with Alzheimer's patients is they were looking at people who had rheumatoid arthritis, and they noticed that there was a 6 to 12-fold lower incidence of Alzheimer's incidence in people who had rheumatoid arthritis than everybody else if you matched them for age and all other conditions. Now that was startling, a 6 to 12-fold difference. They looked at all the factors, and what they found out was it's because they took anti-inflammatories. And that these changes, all these chemicals get in the brain, produce inflammation. So by taking anti-inflammatories, they were reducing their risk. Could possibly either prevent Alzheimer's disease totally or reverse it if it had already started. They found out when you use the leprosy drug, dapsone, which is an anti-inflammatory, in a totally different disease, the same thing happened. They had very low incidence of Alzheimer's disease. Then they did a twin study to rule out that any genetic influence was involved. And in twins, the same thing happened. If one twin took anti-inflammatories and the other didn't, the one who took anti-inflammatories didn't develop Alzheimer's and the other one did. So that makes a lot of difference. Now you have to remember the thing we're most exposed to in our environment that causes free radical generation is in our food, MSG, and NutraSweet, and L-cysteine. All of these excitotoxins are stimulating our brain to produce inflammation through those pathways I showed you yesterday. Now, a little bit about an interesting thing. We've had multiple reports on our national leftist media about this explosion of obesity in America. All our young people are beginning to show this tremendous obesity, and all the brilliant doctors have gotten together and they can't figure out why. Where is it coming from? Well, as I told you in the early experiments, one of the first things that was noticed in the animals exposed to MSB was this unusual obesity. And it's characteristic in that these animals tend to eat more good-tasting food and avoid bad-tasting food. What does that sound like? They eat only a slight excess of food each day, so they're not taking in a lot of calories. They eat fewer meals each day. They eat more quickly. React more emotionally, that is, they're more prone to violence. They're less active. They become couch potatoes. But when more food is readily available, particularly that bad food, they eat more. So this pretty much our society. We have young couch potatoes, junk food, who prefer junk over good food. And so, unfortunately, as obvious as this is and reproducible, this has been done times, they're still ignoring it. And that's not by accident. The interesting thing you see with feeding MSG to a particular strain of mice, you know about juvenile diabetes in children. Well, juvenile diabetes, we know that it's not something that's just hereditary, that there's a hereditary, something in the environment triggers it. It's been thought that it's a virus or an infection during childhood that triggers the diabetes, and at that point they become fully diabetic. Well, there's a strain of mice known as the KK genetic mice. And that mouse, if you expose it to MSG, will develop diabetes. If you overfeed carbohydrates to that mouse, it'll also develop diabetes. But the interesting thing is that one of the triggers, one of the few triggers in that mouse to produce diabetes is MSG. How many children in this country have high amounts of MSG? So if they have a genetic weakness for it and you're giving them a trigger that has been demonstrated experimentally, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Now I'm going to go into a little bit about aspartame. So far I haven't talked about NutraSweet much. If I was a bioweapons designer, if I was going to make weapons to destroy people's minds, if Khrushchev sent me to the United States and said, make something that will destroy their minds but not be obvious, I would have made NutraSweet. NutraSweet, ironically, is made out of 3 well-known brain toxins. They knew that when they were making it. It's made from phenylalanine, which causes mental retardation in children. You've heard of PKU, that's a buildup of phenylalanine in the blood. They knew that. They knew phenylalanine causes seizures. So part of its molecule is phenylalanine. The other part is aspartic acid, which is a powerful excitotoxin that's almost as powerful as glutamate. And they link it together with something called methanol, wood alcohol. Now, the FDA regulates and the EPA regulates wood alcohol because it's so toxic. And they regulate it in minute quantities. They link these 2 molecules together with methanol, so when you consume it, you're not only getting methanol in your blood, but when methanol is consumed, it's broken down into 2 substances, formic acid and formaldehyde. Formic acid is what makes you hurt so bad. That's where I live. But a thing, that's what is released when you consume NutraSweet, formic acid, all through your body in very, very minute quantity. The formaldehyde is probably more toxic. And there's a recent paper just came out in which they studied feeding aspartame to experimental animals and found that the formaldehyde that breaks down enters the cell, attacks the DNA, and breaks the DNA in several areas. And that DNA in humans is removed very slowly. It's hard for our metabolism to remove formaldehyde, so it stays there a long time. And they found that each dose accumulates. So every time you drink a 12-ounce Diet Coke, you're accumulating formaldehyde on your DNA and producing DNA damage. And that's why the people get progressively worse and worse and worse the more they drink it. And I've seen people that were so sick. I had a lady in my office that came to me for NutraSweet poisoning. She was so sick, she told her husband, I can't work anymore. I'm going to have to quit my job. She said, I can't hardly get out of bed. I can hardly, her vision was blurred. She couldn't think. She was just miserable. So I put her on some nutritional changes, took her off the NutraSweet and the MSG, and she came back in 2 weeks. She said, I can't believe it. It's like I've been reborn. Amen. Everywhere I go and speak, she comes. She says, I got to tell everybody. She said, this is the greatest thing that ever happened to me. She said, I never dreamed that something was making me this sick. If you look at the FDA's list of complaints, 80% of all the complaints they get about everything, 80% of them are about NutraSweet. And the list of complaints goes all the way from sudden blindness. We've had, I don't know how many people go blind in one or both eyes. Confusion, dizziness, mental problems, inability to think and remember, seizures, and they list under other death. There has been quite a few NutraSweet deaths that they don't tell you about because people now are drinking these things quarts at a time, 3 quarts a day. I get calls from all over the United States about people who've developed brain tumors because that's why NutraSweet lost its approval originally. When they first applied for a permit to the FDA, the cereal company which made NutraSweet did their own experiment, and in their own experiment, it increased brain tumors 47-fold. And so it was immediately rejected. They said, well, this is way too, and it was dose related. Exposed to, the higher the incidence. From the lowest dose to the highest dose, they all had increased brain tumors. So it lost its approval. And the FDA that came on after that, Arthur Hall Hayes, he was the commissioner. He got together a board of physicians to review the safety of MSG. On that board were 3 neuroscientists, very well-known, respected neuroscientists, and they said, we recommend that this not be approved. It is too dangerous. That are going on with the brain tumors is too great a concern. We recommend it not be approved. Guess what happened? It got approved. And the interesting thing is that several months after it was approved, he left the FDA and went to work for the public relations firm for the NutraSweet. This is not an unusual thing we see in our society. Regulatory agencies are bought by the companies that regulate. They promise them a review of the FDA, and they find out 45 top regulators of the FDA and went to work for the companies they regulate. There's a recent scandal about a diabetic drug that was released. They had a dozen deaths from it. They did an investigation and found out that the FDA authorities who approved it were receiving funds from the company that made the drug, in the tune of $8,000 and more. The American Dietetic Association thinks about how safe NutraSweet is. They have their own journals, their own organizations. They tell the dietitians this. They're constantly saying how safe NutraSweet is. They receive thousands of dollars from the NutraSweet company, from Monsanto. Monsanto sponsors all of their functions. All of their journals, they have full-page ads in all their journals. Back cover ads, the most expensive ad in the whole magazine. The American Diabetes Association receives tons of money from the Monsanto company. The American Diabetic Association journals advertise heavily for NutraSweet. So we don't see a lot of biased literature there. Of course, Monsanto contributes a lot of money to the universities to make sure that the research goes their way. They fund research by scientists to make sure they'll produce papers that will say it's safe, so that when the commentator from 60 Minutes or somewhere else goes to them and says, well, what about these safety issues? They say, oh, look, we have this stack of studies here that it's safe, and these are big in the research field. And in the early days, what happened to Ralph Nader, he was overwhelmed by it. To answer that. Well, fortunately, in 1996, it was Dr. Ralph Walton, who was medicine at Ohio State University, and he looked at 160, examined the safety of NutraSweet just to see how biased they were. Out of those studies, 74 were directly sponsored by the Monsanto company. 90 of them were not funded by the industry. Now, of the independent studies, 90 one or more problems with NutraSweet. The independent studies that did not have problems, 7 of them were in fact sponsored by the FDA, so they weren't really independent either. Of the 74 papers that were sponsored by the NutraSweet company, 100% of them claimed it was safe. So these are the things that are done, and these are the studies that the national media quote. This is the stuff that comes out in your newspapers quoting that it's safe. Now here we go to the brilliant things your government, industry, coalition is doing to you. And what you have to remember is our country is changing. We're no longer a free enterprise country. We have become more a fascist country. Fascism is a union between industry and government. That's how it differs from communism. Rather than like communists going in and shooting all of the managers of business, they form a coalition with them. They say, together, I'll protect you, you protect me, you make sure I stay in power, I'll make sure your product's the only one on this line, and that nobody criticizes you. Well, these geniuses have now, they're not satisfied that we can tell you that MSG is bad, get fresh vegetables from your market. They're going to spray them before you get them. So they're talking about vegetables with MSG. There's a referendum here in California in which they're applying to be able to add MSG to wine. All along, they have been injecting excitotoxins into poultry. That's very common. Bill Clinton, Mr. Tyson, he injects all of his chickens with excitotoxins. That's why they taste good. They add NutraSweet to medicines, to children's medicines particularly. And we found that added to medicine produces physiological effects on these children, behavioral effects. You just have to throw in the fluoride because I'm appalled that a dental society can convince the government to add a toxic substance as toxic as fluoride is. Fluoride is a halogen. Halogens are enormously reactive chemicals. They put a halogen in the water supply. For what? So you have nice teeth. The studies have, since all this has been done, have shown that it has not reduced cavities at all. So you've added a neurotoxin in the recent studies. There's a lot of recent literature out on fluoride and brain development showing it causes neurobehavioral difficulties. It's destroying the intellect of children. And they put it in all the toothpaste. It's hard to find toothpaste except in your health food store that does not have fluoride in it. And read the package on the fluoride toothpaste, what it says. Children under 6 must be supervised when brushing with this, and if they should swallow it, notify poison control or get them to the emergency room immediately. Now, why is something that toxic in your toothpaste? That's on the package. Now, the grapefruit seed extract makes a good tooth wash. Grapefruit seed extract will kill almost any bacteria, protozoa, fungus. You can make a dilute solution and brush your teeth with that. It's much better than any toothpaste that's ever been made. So I thought I would share some of these brilliant things our government has done. Now, we talked a little bit about pharmacies, and Dr. Day came down on the pharmacies pretty heavy. And her criticism, a lot are right on target. You know, there are times that you need to rely on medications for short periods of time, particularly if you have not used good nutritional medicine. If you use good nutritional practices, your need for these medicines will be less than everyone else. Let's look at what I call God's pharmacy. If you look at God's pharmacy, it's all the plants, berries, herbs, nuts, grains. These are filled with unbelievably medicinal chemicals. And there is an enormous amount of research being done on it, because they're finding that these are safer and more effective than the drugs you use for a world of conditions. And this is just some of the things they have recently found that these phytochemicals and flavonoids that are in plants can do. They can chelate iron and copper. You know, I told you one of the problems is as you grow older, you begin to build up this free iron in your blood, and that produces the free radicals, and it's high in Alzheimer's disease and all these other diseases. Well, what plant polyphenols do is they help chelate it. They protect it so that it's not free. It improves the cell membrane. You know, we said that young membranes are more fluid than older membranes. Well, it returns them back to their normal fluid state. We find it can antioxidants in your blood. Every time your blood uses vitamin C or your cells use vitamin C to detoxify free radicals, they become free radicals. And they have to be regenerated back to the reduced form. That's why you take multiple types of antioxidants together. You don't take them alone. And that's why they're in plants in that way, so that you get a multiple combination of antioxidants, and they reduce each other. We find that it can restore cellular glutathione. Glutathione is a natural chemical in all of your cells, and it is the most powerful free radical scavenger in your cell. When it's low, you're going to get disease. When it's high, you're going to have less disease of all types. I don't care what it is. cancer is much, much less if you have high glutathione in your cells. And we find that the cellular glutathione can be increased by plant extracts. They're powerful free radical scavengers for every kind of free radical, more so than vitamins. You always hear about vitamin C, vitamin E, but the bioflavonoids are much more powerful and more versatile free radical scavengers than is vitamin C. They inhibit these inflammatory enzymes. We said disease is related to inflammation. It reduces arthritic pain, it reduces inflammation of the brain, all this inflammation. It can actually block the glutamate receptor partially to help prevent excitotoxic damage. Pycnogenol. Pycnogenol is a fairly good excitotoxicity blocking agent. It can restore the blood-brain barrier. There's a component called anthocyanidins in bilberry that restores the blood-brain barrier. It does the same thing to varicose veins. I've seen patients sometimes. I had a lady one time came with a huge leg, big edematous leg, both her legs, and she'd been to all the doctors, and they took these diuretics and all this kind of stuff. And I said, well, your problem is you need some bilberry, you need to get off those diuretics, it's washing out all your magnesium. I put her on bilberry and saw her 3 weeks later, her legs were normal. So it can prevent leakage from blood vessels, including the brain. And it can increase the uptake of glucose in the brain. That's what ginkgo biloba, one of the things it does. It's incredible. Now let's look at the deterioration of nutritional status since the turn of the century. What's happened to our American diet, we've increased our polyunsaturated fats. Polyunsaturated fats mean they have a lot of double bonds in it. That means they're real reactive. They oxidize real easy. And the American Heart Association, another one of those genius organizations that collects your dollars and tells you foolish things to do, they convince everybody to get on corn oil. We're going to prevent heart attacks. You need more polyunsaturated fat. Let's have everybody on corn oil. What they do, and which was known and is still known, and they still haven't said it, is that corn oil promotes the growth of cancer. If you take an experimental animal, there's a certain species that will not spread their tumors. It'll just grow locally. It'll do that only if you don't give them corn oil. If you give them corn oil, the tumor will spread all over the body. Same thing happens in humans, and it's because it inhibits a substance called prostaglandin PGE2. It'll also increase your likelihood of becoming infected. We find as we increased our polyunsaturated intake, people began taking less antioxidants because they weren't eating as well. So that doubled this. This increases, actually, now it's being shown that all this corn oil increased the likelihood of heart attacks and strokes and arteriosclerosis, not decreased it, because it's so reactive in the blood vessel wall. We've changed the ratio of our omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids from 1 to 1 at the turn of the century when people were healthier. Now it's 30 to 1, and in breast milk, 45 to 1. Now, omega-3 fatty acids is critical for normal brain function, and particularly brain formation. And this is why diets, women are eating so much of the polyunsaturated fat, omega-6 type, that when they have a pregnancy and then they deliver the baby, the brain is starting to be malformed and is hungry for the omega-3 for proper formation. And their breast milk is very low in DHA. That's one of the type of omega-3 fatty acids. And DHA is known to be absolutely critical for normal brain formation. And we're seeing that it's dramatically reduced, 45 to 1 in women. And so we need to increase our intake of omega-3 type fatty acids. We see there's a 2,500% increase in trans fatty acids, a 250% increase in sugar intake, and a dramatic reduction in fruits and vegetable intake. In a recent survey of a large number of normal people, they asked them, how many servings of fruits and vegetables should you eat a day? Only 2% knew the correct amount, 5 servings of fruits and vegetables. You could eat more, but that's the minimum. Only 2%, 98% of the population thought it's perfectly all right to occasionally eat a carrot or look at a leaf of. Now let's look at just a couple of statistics here. 21% lower blood flavonoids in smokers. And they think that this is why smokers get lung cancer. Because their flavonoids are low. Now, I just completed a paper that's going to be published in the Journal of Nutritional Society. It's about how flavonoids not only inhibit the development of cancer, but prevent cancers from growing and spreading. We see that the male vegetarians have 36% higher levels of flavonoids, and the females have 43% higher flavonoids intake. So that's why they have less cancer and less degenerative diseases. Now I'm just going to run through a few things to show you what plants can do. Flavonoids have been shown, these are the flavonoids that are shown to reduce iron-induced peroxidation. Part of the process destroys these cells and produces these degenerative brain diseases. Rutin, hesperidin, quercetin, mangan. These are found in things like grapefruit, oranges, lemons, berries. That's the type of things that are found. Autooxidation neuron membranes, that means just the automatic oxidation of the membrane of these neuron cells. We see it's a different order, but it's the same flavonoid seems to do it. Very common flavonoid. See this in a lot of leafy green, zucchini, you find flavonoid. These different plants that have been tested, this is recently, this is 1998, 1999 material. These were found to protect significant, what we call the hydroxyl radical, that's the most common in degenerative brain diseases and other types of diseases, and powerful inhibitors of that type. Kale, Brussels sprouts, alfalfa sprouts, beets, spinach, broccoli, red and against peroxyl peroxidation or destruction of the green and black tea, kale, spinach, broccoli, beets, green and bell peppers. Report that has shown that spinach and strawberries significantly prevents degeneration of the brain. This process is oxynitrite, tyrosine nitration. This is what happens in Alzheimer to a great extent. This is reacts with this amino acid and clogs up the cell. Flavonoids that are found in plants. These three are found in the spice. These are found in all kinds of leafy green vegetables, found in fruits. They are very powerful in inhibiting these radicals. Signs at me. Now this is the process that takes place in Alzheimer's disease. Now as you go older, this MAOB part of your brain associated with Parkinson's disease, and that the peroxidation of the radical takes place inside that part of the brain. These have been found to powerfully inhibit that reaction. So these have the potential of stopping the progression of the disease. And these are flavonoids from different plants, green plants, squash, kale, broccoli. Coenzyme Q10 is an energy molecule that you primarily produce energy. Carnitine has to do with fat metabolism and also glucose metabolism. So you see a lot of these different things in here that have on the other slides. So these flavonoids are being shown to be extremely potent and protective. As I in Alzheimer's disease, we energy producing enzymes significantly decrease so that the brain's not able to produce its energy. And as I told you, that occurs a decade before the disease actually presents itself. So we know these enzymes are depressed. In Parkinson's disease, it's what they call complex 1 deficiency. That's the first phase of the electron transport chain in the mitochondrion. And this occurs decades before the disease occurs clinically. Now the question is there anything we can do about that? And these can increase cellular energy, including in the brain. We know enzyme Q10 is very powerful in stimulating energy production in cells of all types, particularly brain cells. It does increase in the brain when you feed it to humans. Acetyl-L-carnitine, the vitamins thiamine, riboflavin, pyridine, nicotinamide, which is the metabolic form of vitamin energy stimulant, ginkgo biloba, and alpha-lipoic acid. All of them are found naturally in the body, but they begin to be decreased as you age, and some through dietary methods or through supplementation, you can affect the brain. When you combine coenzyme Q10 and niacinamide, you can prevent excitotoxicity, the part of the brain that causes Parkinson's disease. Nitric oxide is the key to all of this excitotoxic process. There's a cell. It says I have 30 seconds. Nitric oxide is the trigger where it first starts the destructive process, and these are all the things that inhibit that nitric oxide. Again, these are all things found in fruits and vegetables and berries and herbs. Some of the really powerful things we have available, acetylcarnitine, seems to reverse the aging process in brain cells. It actually restores the receptors on the membrane. It restores the fluidity of the membrane, the ability to produce energy. It chelates iron. It's an antioxidant. It increases the coenzyme Q10 in the cell, which is a protective molecule. This is a drug that crazy kids that play with drugs designed and produced instant Parkinson's disease. It blocks that. MSG take acetyl-L into the brain, so that's another reason not to eat MSG. Alpha-lipoic is an enormously powerful free radical scavenger. It chelates metals. You can use cadmium poisoning or mercury poisoning with it. It'll reverse it. It regenerates all the other antioxidants, increases coenzyme Q10 in the brain, is enormously protective. It blocks the excitotoxin by 50%, protective of the brain. Homocysteine, you need to know about this. You've heard about cysteine, I assume. This is more of an indicator that you're going to have a and is high cholesterol. Homocysteine is an amino acid, and in the cells, it's associated with increased birth defects. This is why women that are pregnant should take supplemental folic acid, B12, B6, because it prevents these malformations of the nervous system. It'll prevent strokes and heart attacks, significant reduction. And recently it's been found that every case examined of Alzheimer's has homocysteine in their blood, every case. And that you can restore homocysteine by using those three vitamins, vitamin B12, to return it to normal. So it may be, this hasn't had time to test this yet because this has just been discovered. It may prevent Alzheimer's disease. And we know that people that have Alzheimer's disease have very low B12 levels, even though their blood levels are normal. And they go to the doctor always says it's normal. But when you test the brain, you find it's low. So you can't go by blood levels. This, I emphasize magnesium again. Nothing is more important than magnesium. It is the most powerful protectant of the brain that we know of. 75% of the population is deficient in it. A recent study of 36,000 normal people found that 75% of them were deficient in magnesium intake. When you lower the magnesium in an animal, you double the amount of free radicals that are formed. Free radicals are twice as lethal. It depletes the cellular molecule, so it is enormously, enormously toxic to have low magnesium levels. Plants are very high in magnesium. Conclusion, don't have time for it. What should we do? Of course, we need to strengthen our spirit through prayer and worship always. What we do in terms of prayer and worship affects the brain. That's been proven. So that's Christians generally are healthier, happier, and better adjusted. Amen. Even though they hate us. But it's okay if the pagans hate us. Observe the day of rest, very important. And this book that we quote, the Bible, is so filled with that day of rest is top of the line research. Because what's been found, if you have chronic unrelieved stress, it greatly increases the free radiation in your brain. They have measured the concentration of DNA, protein in your cells and the cell membranes under stress and found a increase in the brain. But if you have the stress and then the next day start it back, it prevents these changes. So that period of rest regenerates it. And actually, you get stronger. Each week comes back. As long as you have a day of rest, harming you, strengthens you. So there we go. The use of omega-3 fatty acid. Seed oil is a great source. Always keep it in the refrigerator. Flaxseed is easily oxidized when it heats. Never cook with it. But it is an excellent oil for health, inflammation. It reduces arthritis, destruction. Extra virgin olive oil. Don't use the oil except cooking anything else but extra virgin olive oil. It's because extra virgin olive oil, saturated fat, contains a lot of flavonoids that have been shown to be inhibitors and prevent cancer growth. It has also been shown to improve blood flow through the coronary arteries and through the carotid arteries to the brain to prevent strokes and heart attacks. It strengthens the blood cells, and there's a recent shown it is actually improved function in the elderly using it regularly. During pregnancy, I recommend that pregnant women take additional flaxseed oil, is a good source of it, to make sure you're getting enough DHA for the development of the child's brain. Moderate amounts of whole grain, eat berries, all sorts of which are bioflavonoids that inhibit cancer, inhibit degenerative brain diseases. These berries are very, very powerful. Avoid cow's milk. You know about the substance. Avoid refined sugars and carbohydrates. About that, drink lots of it. You have to drink distilled water or have a type of fluoride out of your water, or have well water, but keep the fluoride out of your water. Exercise regularly. Exercise actually makes the brain function better. A little bit about plasticity. Plasticity means that the brain, while we don't know, we know that the little connections can, and that they grow all the way into year 80. There's been a study on 80. They are also to grow these dendritic connections, these synaptic, and that the diet plays a big part in it. Exercise plays a big part in it. So all of these things are working together to improve brain function, and it'll continue all the way into the late years. And avoid those nasty excitotoxins. See, before they... Yeah, okay. I'm at the waterfall, and when I get to the waterfall, wet.
Now you know why we wanted to have Dr. Blaylock here. We were a little bit emphasizing Dr. Blaylock's qualifications, and he's such a humble man. He reminded us of it. I remembered it myself. Dr. Blaylock is a neurosurgeon, been practicing for over 20 years. He does teaching at University of Mississippi in Jackson. He's published numerous scientific articles in many very respected medical journals. But most important, Dr. Blaylock's a Christian. And he loves God. And we're glad you were here.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation and have gained a blessing from the information presented in it. From all of us here at Modern Manna, may God richly bless you.